Hello, thank you so much for joining us today for At Home with the Smithsonian Libraries, African American History and Culture Unbound. I'm Gabriella Kahn from the Smithsonian Libraries Advancement Team, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to our program. We hope that everything will go as smoothly as possible, but just in case there are any hiccups, please bear with us. We are recording the program so that we can share it with those who weren't able to join us today, or if there are any technical issues. And just like so many of you, our speakers today are at home with families and pets, so please excuse any potential background sounds or surprise guests. At our last program, we shared how the Smithsonian's ability to tell the complete American story relies on the Smithsonian Libraries. And this ability would be incomplete without our library at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, or NMAAHC, as we affectionately call it. Especially because this library was planned and built in conjunction with the planning and the building of the museum, it's really a perfect example of how our library collections illuminate the incredible stories behind the objects that you see on display at the museum, and how our librarians assist and guide the curators and researchers who aim to tell those stories. And like I mentioned the other week, sometimes our librarians are the ones who tell the stories themselves using our unique, special, and rare collections. So today we want to share more with you about how the library's phenomenal collections not only support, inform, and are often an integral part of museum exhibitions at the Smithsonian, but are actually also the subject of their own special exhibits, in particular at NMAAHC. Through an engaging conversation between two of our librarians, we want to give you some behind the scenes insight into these exhibits and the NMAAHC Library in general, with time for your questions at the end. So before we dive in, I just want to give a huge thank you to our anonymous lead sponsor of this program, whose generous donation is going directly to support all of the awesome work that goes on at the NMAAHC Library that you're about to hear about, and so much more that we won't have time to share today. And it's thanks to supporters like our sponsor this evening and like all of you that we're able to continue to serve as a trusted resource for knowledge. So with that, I am thrilled to turn it over to our wonderful librarians and ask them to introduce themselves to you before they start their interview. So Brandee, let's start with you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brandee Worsham, and I'm the reference librarian at the National Museum of African American History and Culture Library. My career includes time at academic and museum libraries and various stints outside of library land, including public relations and even selling cars. And so I was born and raised in Eastern North Carolina. I earned my undergraduate degree in journalism and mass communication from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Once I moved to the DC metro area, I worked as a library technician in the Alexandria campus library at Northern Virginia Community College. My Smithsonian career began in 2012 at the National Museum of Natural History Library and the John Wesley Powell Library of Anthropology. After over a decade in the library field, I returned to school and earned my master's degree in library and information science from Drexel University. Each and every experience allowed me to use my sense of curiosity and creative thinking to help others find information. And as the reference librarian at the National Museum of African American History and Culture Library, I answer research questions from the Smithsonian staff and the general public. I get to delve deep into one of my favorite subjects and find out more about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I also assist head librarian Shauna Collier in whatever way I can, and I work with the entire staff of the library to meet the needs of our users and attend to the collection. And that's enough about me, and I'd like to turn it over now to the head librarian, Shauna Collier.
Thank you, Brandee. Hello, everyone. I'm Shauna Collier, and I'm the head librarian for the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where I manage the day-to-day operations of the library branch with administrative, programmatic, and supervisory responsibilities, as well as responsibilities in creating and applying branch policy services and outreach efforts. I was born in Chicago, but like many Chicagoans, I have family roots in Mississippi. And so I grew up in Clarksdale, Mississippi. I would have to say that both places influenced my career choice because Clarksdale is where I grew up attending the local Carnegie Library. I practically lived in that place. And Chicago is where I spent my summers visiting their fantastic museum. I've been in my current position since early 2014, and this is actually my second time around working for Smithsonian Libraries. My first position was as the librarian for the Anacostia Community Museum. And prior to my return to Smithsonian Libraries, before I returned for this position, I was the Sonia Haynes Stone Center librarian for Black Culture and History at UNC Chapel Hill. And then other previous positions include working as a reference librarian with the public library system in Savannah, Georgia, as a records librarian for the Environmental Protection Agency, and as the archivist for the Herndon Home Museum, which is a historic house museum in Atlanta, Georgia. And then at the very beginning of my library career, I did an internship with the Auburn Avenue Research Library in African American History and Culture, also in Atlanta. I received a BS degree in marketing research from Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi, and my Master of Information and Library Studies from the University of Alabama, Tuscaloosa. My research interests include topics in African American culture, in African American family history, and in the history of African American communities.
All right, Shauna. So let's get started with the conversation. And we're going to talk a bit about the exhibits. But before we get into that, I want to ask you my first question, which is, could you tell us all a little bit about the National Museum of African American History and Culture Library and why it's so important?
Sure. The National Museum of African American History and Culture Library, again, we affectionately call it NMAAHC for short. It's the 21st branch in the Smithsonian Library system. And because our primary purpose is to support the research of the NMAAHC staff, our focus is on African American history and culture as well. We have a collection size of about 4,000 volumes, and we collect in almost all formats, but mostly books and journal articles, be that in print or in digital formats. And we also have a small rare book collection. The library includes a reading room, of course, computers that researchers can use if they don't bring their own, and of course, copier scanners, that kind of thing for use by our patrons. We are a staff of 4, including the 2 of us, of course, and then our library technician is Shonda Harden, and our staff genealogist is Hollis Gentry. And speaking of Hollis, having a genealogist on staff is one of the things that's unique about our branch, and that we can offer genealogy reference assistance to our patrons. But we're similar to all of the other Smithsonian Library branches because we also provide reference, we provide library instruction and research assistance to the museum staff and to external researchers who are independent of the Smithsonian. And we also allow independent researchers to visit and use our libraries by appointment, but of course, that's on hold right now because of the pandemic. One more thing I'd like to say about our branch in particular is that we are one of a few Smithsonian libraries that is not in a staff-only space, but instead we're located on a floor that's accessible to museum visitors. And this was purposely done because our inaugural director of the museum, Lonnie Bunch, now Secretary Bunch, he wanted us to be more visible to the museum visitors in order to make them aware that we were there and we were a part of the museum, that we were important. And I think this presents a great segue to answer the second part of your question as to why our library is important.
Yes.
I would say the library is important for a number of reasons, but primarily because just like all of the Smithsonian Library branches, we provide an essential service of assisting our museum staff, our curators, and again, independent researchers with their research needs by locating the resources that help them do their jobs. And I place emphasis on that because, in other words, whenever you see what I call a finished product of an exhibit or a museum program or a publication such as a book, journal article, or any type of scholarship that comes from their research, you can usually thank a librarian. And actually, this is one of the things I love about being a librarian. I like helping people with their informational needs. And I love seeing the final product and knowing, if only to myself sometimes, that I had a role in that.
Absolutely. There's a lot of joy in helping people find what they need. And so when it comes to the exhibits that we have for the library, how did you get started with creating exhibits for the Namak Library? Like, was this an early idea for the library, or did you develop it over the years during the planning process?
Well, I'll answer the second part of that question first, because no, it was not an early idea as far as I knew. And it's actually kind of funny how it came about. So as I said earlier, I started in the position as the head librarian in early 2014, in January actually. And right away I became engrossed with, all of the details and building the library from the ground up. However, during that time, during that planning phase, the exhibit case nor an exhibit space was ever mentioned. Matter of fact, during the planning process for the museum, for the library itself, we lost a bit of space that was planned for the library. So my only thought at that time was having enough space for the staff and of course for the collection. Then in May of 2016, roughly 4 months before the museum opened, I was asked to attend a meeting with the museum's exhibit staff to discuss ideas for our first library exhibit. And I was like, what? but then I went to this meeting thinking, oh, okay, we're probably going to be part of a larger exhibit in the museum itself. But I got to the meeting and I found out just the opposite. As it turns out, no one was aware of this gorgeous exhibit case that was designed for the library, we think by the architects, until the museum was pretty far along in the construction phase. And this is what you're seeing in the slide. So I had to really scramble to create that first exhibit in order to open it along with the museum, which was happening a few months later.
Oh boy. That sounds like a lot of work in a little bit of time. So if you could do us a favor and tell us a little more about the first exhibit, like what was the title? What all was involved? What did it entail?
Well, the first exhibit was titled Selections from the Library's Special Collection, and it ran from September 2016 until about December 2018. And I'll admit this really wasn't my first idea. My first idea was to create an exhibit of books based on all of the exhibits in the museum, all of the themes running through the museum. But I soon realized that was quite too ambitious because this was not my first time creating a library exhibit. I had done a few smaller ones on previous jobs, so I just knew there wouldn't be enough time to develop something like that on this grand scheme before the museum itself opened. So then I thought about what might I want to see if I was visiting the museum for the first time? And also, what would help promote the library and show visitors and potential researchers this fantastic collection that we have. And I'll also admit it was just easier to select books that I thought would be fascinating to see instead of trying to pull books around a central theme. So that's kind of how the exhibit idea came about. The titles included in this exhibit, you're seeing this in the slides that we're showing right now. One of my favorite in this exhibit was a Cab Calloway book that he authored titled Of Minnie the Moocher and Me. It's in the bottom left corner of this slide. And you probably can't see the inscription, but he signed it Heidi Ho Calloway. And so I just love that. I also want, if I may, take a moment to point out that the majority, if not all of the books in this first exhibit came from generous donors. And many items in our rare book collection are the result of donations or are acquisitions from donor funds, such as the Marjorie F. and Edgar M. Macenta Fund for Illustrated Books, or the S. Dillon Ripley Endowment Fund, from funds made available through the library's Adopt a Book program, and then from funds from single donations from individuals. So there are many people we have to thank for the awesome contributions to our library collection.
Wonderful. So that sounds like a good, successful first run. So after that inaugural exhibit, what was next?
Well, the next exhibit didn't start to come together until well after the library opened. And I should note here that the construction of the library was delayed because the museum was focused on opening those public parts of the museum first. And while the library is on a public floor, as I said earlier, it's not a public space where a visitor can just freely walk in. So the library itself didn't truly open until about the spring of 2017, about 6 months after the museum opened to the public. In the meantime, the Archive Center of the National Museum of American History, they were looking for a library home for some of the books that were part of their Ella Fitzgerald collection. And so they approached us about adding them to our library collection. And of course, I quickly said, yes. And then in 2017, I was processing this collection. I was preparing it for cataloging. And as I was going through it, I realized that some of the books from this collection would be perfect for a library exhibit. So I created a library exhibit titled Ella's Books, Volumes from the Library of Ella Fitzgerald. And it ran from January 2019 through like February 2020, February of this year. And it proved to be quite popular. It was included in the Smithsonian Year of Music that happened in 2019. It was one of the events that was listed along with that. And it was also picked up by the Associated Press. So I was quite pleased with that. Most of the subjects covered in the collection are, of course, music related, but there were some surprises, at least to me, like the cookbooks that were part of the collection with her little notations sprinkled throughout them, and books that showed her travels around the world and her interest in art and in languages and so on. So therefore, my idea for this exhibit was to show some of the music related books, of course, but to mainly show the books that I felt that spoke to those parts of her that the general public might not have known. I also wrote an introductory text that talked about this, about how librarians love to go to someone's home and read the books in their personal collection.
Oh, yeah.
And this is what I attempted to do with the exhibit. In the slides, you can see some of the items, that were part of the exhibit. And I have to say that creating this exhibit was pure joy for me, Brandee, because I've always been an Ella Fitzgerald fan, and it made me feel I had some special insight into her personal life and that I was connected to her in some type of way. So in this exhibit, one of my favorite books was the Picasso Book, and that's what you're seeing in this slide. We were staging it for installation. I love this book because there's a legendary story attached to it about Ella not meeting Picasso and the resulting work of art that he created as a result of that. And so I won't go into the story here, you can look it up, but it's a really cute story. And then after Ella, was our third and current exhibit of Uncle Tom's Cabin early and notable editions. And this exhibit highlights many of the early first editions of Uncle Tom's Cabin and the titles that are considered notable because of particular features or because they are rare or maybe collector's items. And all of them are held within Smithsonian Library collections. So the idea for this exhibit came about because around the time of the museum opening in 2016, we were receiving generous book donations from collectors, bibliophiles, historians, and from people who just wanted a good home for some of the rare books in their personal collections. And so I found that the book that seemed to be donated more than any other was Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was like every time I opened a box, there was a different edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And for the non-librarians out there, a different edition means a different publisher or a different date, or maybe it had a different foreword. And so that led me to research the various editions. And I found that there was this amazing and surprising history tied to the initial publishing of the novel in 1852. And this eventually led to the idea of creating an exhibit. The exhibit opened this year, right at the end of February, and about 2 weeks before the institution temporarily closed because of the pandemic. So we got it in for 2 weeks. And but in that time, the museum has reopened. The museum reopened about a month ago, but we decided to not reopen the Uncle Tom's Cabin exhibit right away because we're trying to use this time as an opportunity to rest the books. And because once we do reopen the exhibit, we want to extend the amount of time that it will run. And in this slide, you can see how this is the exhibit case. The exhibit is closed. It's covered with this fantastic graphic that our exhibit designer created for us. And it just kind of explains things about the exhibit and the fact that it's temporarily closed.
Great. Who doesn't love Ella Fitzgerald, right? But so when it came to Uncle Tom's Cabin, why exactly was it so important to showcase so many different copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin in the exhibit?
Well, actually, that was the main point of creating the exhibit, right? So, as I said, during the exhibit research, I was surprised to find that there were so many different editions published in a very short period of time, and not only in the US, but also abroad. So, and this was the mid 19th century, mind you. So I thought this also might be of interest to our visitors. And I also found it fascinating that this very impactful novel was authored by a woman, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was involved in almost all aspects of publishing the various editions. Sure, the publishing companies were trying to maximize their profits and trying to come up with new and improved editions because the book was selling like hotcakes. But I was surprised to find that Stowe was so involved with the publishing companies and how she used that to help the novel become and remain a bestseller. However, this was also a little bit of a challenge when creating this exhibit. Almost all the books in the exhibit had the same title. But I got around that because most of the editions had become known by their nicknames or what I call their street names of the popular edition or the Brunswick edition or the London edition. And you're seeing some of these particular editions pictured in these slides. One of my favorites from this exhibit is the slide you're seeing right now. It's a Spanish edition, La Cabana de Tam, published in Madrid, Spain in 1918. And I just love the illustrations that were included in this edition. And then another favorite is the one you're seeing on this slide, It was published in 1938 by the Limited Editions Club. It included 16 lithographs, and it was illustrated by the famous Harlem Renaissance artist, Miguel Covarrubias. And I love that image right there.
The last one is my personal favorite. Yes. And so it looks like you put a lot of effort and research into each exhibit. And so how do you develop your ideas for the exhibits? And what is your research process?
Ooh, good question. So my ideas for the exhibits have come in a variety of ways, such as perhaps suggestions from staff, maybe a companion to a larger exhibit or theme, or maybe for the anniversary of a major event in African American history, or it could be a trending topic or whatever. But for the most part, from our collection. So, for example, I'll make a note of a subject that might be a trending topic, and then I'll go through our collection to see what we have that could be a part of an exhibit. And then the reverse is also true. I'll go through the collection and realize we have quite a bit of a particular subject that might make a perfect exhibit. And this is what happened with Ella Fitzgerald and the Uncle Tom cabin exhibit. Then once I have an idea of what I'd like to do, I begin the research process, which involves selecting the potential books, reading the scholarship on the subject in order to have the correct information for the content, for the labeling, the script, etc. Meeting with the library's conservator, where she will say yes or no to books that I might want to include, because we have to consider the physical condition. And then meeting with the exhibit team and the exhibit designer to determine what might be doable in terms of the display. And then after that initial meeting with all of those teams, I then pursue other items we might want to include, such as images, archival material, or objects, anything like that to help tell the story. After that, I would say it's a lot of back and forth and many, many meetings with all of the parties involved, writing and editing the script and the labels, seeking copyright permissions if necessary, deciding on the items that will rotate out at the 6-month mark, all of that right up until the day of installation.
Okay. So it's not just, I think I'll put these books in a case.
I wish.
Oh, yes. And so we're small but mighty. And so what would you say distinguishes our library exhibits from the museum's exhibits?
Actually not much, but for the most part, the size, of course, we're on a smaller scale. And then what we exhibit. And for us, that's going to be mostly books. Also, our main purpose is to illuminate our collections while also educating the general public. And I know education is the primary purpose of the museum exhibits and of Smithsonian as a whole, because after all, the Smithsonian's longtime motto has been for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. I like saying that.
So do I. It's powerful. And so this next question, it almost pains me to ask it, but I have to ask it. So some people consider books and even libraries to be increasingly irrelevant in today's culture, which of course is hard to believe. But what would you say is the ultimate purpose of having library exhibits in the first place?
Well, first of all, I've got to fill that library case.
There's that.
But all jokes aside, we create exhibits, I would say, for two main reasons. One, to highlight the gems in our collection, while also educating visitors and the general public. And then as an outreach effort to attract potential researchers to our collection. Because as you know, we are, after all, a research library. And so we collect books not just to have them or to possess them. We collect because of the information contained within them. And then we want to make them available to our research community.
Great. So This is my last question for you for now. Of course, later there's Q&A for both of us, which, okay. But what part of the exhibit process is the most fun for you? Because it sounds like a lot of effort, but what's the most fun part? And then what is the most challenging part?
Ooh, good question. The most fun, I would say the most fun has to be the discoveries made during the research process.
Okay.
I'll go into the research process thinking I know quite a bit about the topic, and then I find out I actually don't know a whole lot. So I love learning more about a book or an author, a topic, whatever, and then essentially transferring what I've learned from that research to a visual story. The most challenging is funding. You know, funding is always an issue when we're talking about working in the nonprofit world. But another major challenge has been the exhibit case. Um, as I said earlier, the exhibit case, it was a complete surprise to me and to those involved with planning the library. So what that means is that none of us, including the museum's exhibit team, had any input into the design of the case. And don't get me wrong, it's a beautiful case aesthetically, but each installation has been a challenge because of the difficulties in accessing the case. The shelving has been an issue. We've had issues with the lighting, casting shadows on some of the items in the case. So as a result, these issues have really limited what I can display, and I've had to make some really hard choices in selecting exhibit items. So thankfully, the museum's library exhibit team has decided to pursue a redesign of the case in order to resolve a lot, if not all, of the issues. That's what you're seeing here in the slide. But we want to keep the overall footprint and the aesthetics, of course. And so our hope is to be in a position to begin the work of the redesign right after Uncle Tom's Cabin ends in 2022.
Great. Thank you so much, Shauna and Brandee. That was just fantastic. And I will say I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did too. And in fact, Shauna, before you mentioned the challenges with the current exhibit case, I had never really thought about how important the design of it really is, and how much it can either limit your ability to tell these stories or can really enhance it. So I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I also want to share with everyone that we are seeking philanthropic gifts to support this redesign so that we can better share these treasures and important stories about African American history and culture. So if you are interested in learning more about this opportunity, we would love to hear from you. Please email silrsvp@si.edu for more information. So now, actually, before we open it up to audience questions, Shauna, I think there were a couple other things that you wanted to share. So please go ahead.
Yeah, I really want to take this time to thank the number of people that are involved. I think sometimes it sounds like it's just me creating these exhibits, that it's all mine, and you know. But I really want to emphasize the incredible amount of work that goes into each exhibit and the number of people that are involved. I like to say that it truly takes a village of people, from the exhibit teams to the library staff in the various Smithsonian Library branches, to the staff at other Smithsonian museums who rush in to assist in providing images and other items from their collections for the exhibits, and even to external contributors such as the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center, the Ella Fitzgerald Foundation, and then even other research libraries across the country. So in other words, it's an enormous amount of work. It involves a lot of people, and I'm very grateful for all who have eagerly contributed donated their time and resources. And again, one more time to those who have donated books or who have donated funds so that we could acquire them. I can't forget about them, as they have really helped to make these exhibits possible. And I'd also like to go back to Brandee's first question and expound a little bit more about why the Namak Library is important. You know, as librarians, we are involved with all of the work leading up to a museum opening. And that was the case with me with the Namak opening. And again, it was an enormous amount of work. I know I keep saying that. But the next thing I knew, it was time for the staff preview. And this happens usually about a week before the museum opens. So I was walking through the exhibits, and I was particularly struck with connecting how my library colleagues and I had assisted the curators with the exhibits that I was viewing. For example, like realizing some of the historical data that we helped to find was on some of the labels, or how we assisted in finding some of the images that were on exhibit, or helping to identify the dates or subjects of some of those images. Or we might have helped to locate biographical information on an artist or a musician, or et cetera. So I really did get goosebumps when I realized all of that. And even though I don't, like most librarians I know, I don't toot my own horn, but I truly understood at that moment our place in the Smithsonian with all of this. You know, some people don't realize that the Smithsonian is an educational institution first and foremost, that conducts research in the same way as any other similar organizations, such as a college or university. So within the Smithsonian Libraries, we like to say that we are at the center or the heart of this great institution. And I sincerely believe that, because how could you have a large research institution such as this without libraries, and particularly without librarians? The answer is simply, you cannot. Thank you. Thank you, Brandee. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Shauna. That was great.
Yeah, that was great. And yeah, Shauna, you really summed it up so perfectly at the end there. So Kat, thank you both so much again for that fantastic interview. And now I want to open it up to our audience questions. We've already gotten a number in so far, but if anyone else wants to submit their questions, please go ahead using the Q&A feature. So here is our first question. So you talked about various kinds of donations, and there's some curiosity around donating books to the library. So how can someone donate books, and do you accept all books on African American subjects?
I guess I'll take the first question. Well, we have a lot of great supporters, and we appreciate and are so thankful for all the people that donate to the library. We just have to be mindful of both the space constraints that we have, because our actual footprint is not very large in the museum, as well as our collection development goals. And so it's not that we want to say, no. We just ask that you contact us first. And that way we can assess exactly what you have, what we need. And if it's something that we may already have, or there might be a better home for it, we definitely encourage other libraries to be also in the forefront of your mind, because we're not going to be greedy and take everything that's the best. We want to be part of the larger library community. And if someone has something that is pertinent to their local library, give them first dibs. It's great, because we all work together. And so, of course, we're also working from home, as you can tell. And so we can't accept physical donations right now because we're not there to process them. But we also have information on the museum's website. We have a page that's dedicated to the library. And if you go on that page, you'll see more information about the parameters that we have in place about what donations we can and cannot accept.
Great, amen.
Thank you, Brandee. So another popular question here is something that Shauna, you touched on briefly, but when will the exhibit reopen? And what is the next exhibit after Uncle Tom's Cabin? And sort of part of that question, someone was also wondering, is how can you go and see the exhibit? Is it something you can go see on your own, or is it you enter the museum and you wait in line and you go through the whole process of with the passes and everything? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Right. So we are hoping to reopen the exhibit, provided there's whatever is going on with the museum or the institution at that time. We're hoping to reopen it the week before Thanksgiving of this year, and then run it, like I said, until about spring of 2022. Again, though, that could change. We'll reassess as we get closer to that date. And then as far as the next exhibit, well, I have some ideas. As you can see, I'm at home. But we've had meetings to discuss, possible ideas for the next exhibit. And so I have a couple of ideas in mind. I won't talk about them right now. I want them to be a surprise. And I am able to do the research remotely. So I have begun that process of exploring what we have in the collection and what would be great to have as part of an exhibit. And then back to Uncle Tom's Cabin, once it does reopen, as I said, the museum has reopened itself. And I believe all of the Smithsonian museums are requiring passes at this time while we're still, in the pandemic phases. And so once you enter the museum, it's on the second floor where the library is located. So you'll be able to view it at that time, but you do have to have a pass to get into the museum.
Thanks, Shauna. So another question here. So this viewer says that my grandmother Aldine Davis's cookbook was in Ella Fitzgerald's collection. How would I find out if it's in your collection now?
Oh, what was the title of it?
It says
Because I remember.
Soul Food for Thought.
Oh, that sounds very familiar. I'll look that up.
Okay.
That sounds it was not in the exhibit because the collection itself is about 50 books. And because of the case, again, we could only exhibit about 10 from the collection. But also, we didn't receive everything from the Archive Center at the National Museum of American History. I believe there's still some books from that Ella Fitzgerald collection that's maybe still in their archival collection. So it could be there. But just off the top of my head, I can't remember if that was one of them. I should have the catalog up so I can search.
But we can definitely follow up about that. Yeah. Yes. Another question. So this person says, I don't know if this is as binary a choice as I'm making it, but is the goal of your exhibits to highlight the existing holdings of your library? Or is it to tell a story that relates to the museum's mission? Do you try to make the library exhibits connect with the museum exhibits?
Good question. So the first part of that, yes, we are trying to highlight the collection. That's our primary purpose in exhibiting these items. But we're also trying to educate, through telling a story. For example, for the Uncle Tom's Cabin exhibit, I didn't know that there were all of these editions that were published in a short period of time. And then even the novels that were referred to as the anti-Uncle Tom novels, I was not familiar with them and found out, we had one in our collection. So as I find information, I always assume, the general public would love to know this as well. And that's why I say to educate our visitors and the general public as well. As far as trying to connect it to the museum, yes, I would love to do that. And actually, with planning the next so many exhibits, we've already talked about that, trying to time it with maybe a major exhibit in the museum or, like I said, maybe a major event, an anniversary of something coming up in African American history. So yes, I try to do all of that. Unfortunately, we have one case and we're limited as to what. And then we want to have things up for at least a year.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
Great question, though.
Yeah, it is. Another question, do you have Elizabeth Keckley's novel about living in the White House in the collection?
It's not in my collection, but I'm almost certain it's in the National Museum of American History Libraries collection. Yes, we might have it as well, but yes, I am familiar with that title.
And I'm sure that if the person who asked that question wants to know more, we can share that later as well. Yeah. So someone also asked, can you tell us more about the Adopt-A-Book program?
Oh, you want to take that one, Gabi?
Sure. But then I might turn it back over to both of you to tell us a little bit more maybe about some of the specific books that are available. But yeah, the Adopt-A-Book program at the libraries is really incredible. We offer a selection of books from all of our branches available for adoption. And basically, we have two types of adoptions. We have adoptions to build the collection, and we have adoptions to preserve for the future. So if you adopt a book to build the collection, the funds that you donate to adopt that book will go to help purchase other books that will, expand our base of knowledge. And if you adopt a book to preserve it for the future, then it will get the TLC that it needs to bring it back to its almost original condition, so that it can last for many more generations to come. So it's really a wonderful opportunity for anyone to have a lasting impact on the work that we do at the Smithsonian, and to actually have your name on a piece of the Smithsonian, because we do include a physical book plate in all of the books that are adopted. And we also have a digital book plate that's available online. So yeah, I would love for Shauna or Brandee to tell us some more about some of the books that you've had as part of the adoption program.
Well, the two that jump into my head first are two of my favorites in the collection. One is a 1926, I believe it's 26th edition of The Weary Blues by Langston Hughes, and he signed it, and I just love that. I love that he touched the book. And actually, there's a DC connection. He published, this was his first book, a book of poems he published while he was a busboy working here in DC. And he wrote some of his poems on a napkin, as the story goes, and handed it to, a potential publisher or editor or whatever that he saw in the restaurant. And then the rest is history. His first book was The Weary Blues. And that was put up for adoption, and it got snatched up. And then the other book, this small little book titled The Psalms of David, it was published 1814. And the author is Isaac Watts, Dr. Watts, as he's well known, who wrote quite a bit of hymns that, we sing in Christian church or whatever. And that was adopted, I believe, at our event last year. And then one of my favorites that I think was recently adopted is we also have, books from the 19th century that we like to put up for adoption, 20th century. But one that was recently published in recent years was a book about African American lions, as they're known. And it was so colorful, and I just love the photo images in it. And I put it up for adoption because we did not have enough of that, I felt, in the collection. And so one of the reasons we also do adopt a book program, as you said, is to help build our collection so that we can continue to collect in a particular subject, perhaps. So those are some of the ones that just popped into my head.
I guess for me, because you named three really great titles, I would actually like to emphasize the fact that I see some of these books when they're adopted for preservation purposes, and then they come back to us from preservation. And when they go out, sometimes the cover's hanging off and the pages look really fragile. And then we get it back months later, once they're adopted. And the preservation staff, they send it back to us. And I have literally had times when I'll get a book and it comes, like we'll get mail from the various branches that go back and forth. And I'll open the box and see this book. And I'm like, now why was this sent to preservation? That looks fine. And then I'll remember, oh, it was sent to preservation and it comes back. It might not be pristine like it just came off the press, but it looks great. They do a marvelous job.
Yes, they
And
do
I have had times
excellent.
when I have to look and see, oh, that's where they repaired it, but it takes a moment. And so that to me is both the strength of Adopt a Book, but also I have to give great kudos to our preservation department.
And once those books come back that have, had, our conservator has, tended to them or whatever, I'm then able to consider them for exhibit now that they're in better shape.
Right.
So yeah, they do excellent work, I have to admit.
Yeah, definitely. And if anyone wants to see some more about that, we have a feature on our blog that we can share that shows, in-depth treatments that our conservators have done on some of these books, which is, it's fascinating, and they do incredible work. And I also just want to say, Shauna, Dandelion is one of my favorite books that's available for adoption. Yeah, I remember it very vividly because the same reasons what you said about, it's so colorful and unique, and just, I just loved the images in it. So I might have to adopt that one myself. So let's see, another question here. So the incoming director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Kevin Young, is a poet. So can you tell us some more about the Namak Library's poetry collection and any potential related programming or potential exhibit ambitions?
Another good question. So yes, excited about the fact that we'll have a poet as our museum director. And, it's really funny. I was telling someone weeks ago when he was first announced as the incoming director that for some reason, over the last few years especially, I've been really beefing up the poetry collection in the Namak Library. And there were times when I was about to purchase something, I'm thinking, why? Why am I purchasing this? Except that we do collect, we're one of the few branches that actively collects literature, because that's a part of African American culture, of course. And so, I would say we have a pretty robust, from Paul Laurence Dunbar, some of the rare books, Langston, Hughes, right up into some of the contemporary poets that you're seeing. So actually, I think that's the great idea for a future exhibit. I hadn't thought of that until now. Thanks, whoever, for putting that in my head. But yeah, there's a big interest in poetry too at our museum by our curators. And then some of these are a little bit obscure. So I figure it's best to collect them so that, you know, we want to be one of a few libraries perhaps that will have a certain poetry book. I especially love some of the poetry that's coming out of the social justice movements that we're seeing. Just some very talented people are writing poetry books. So as for Kevin, yes, we're going to collect his poetry, of course. Yes, and I would love to do a program. Um, yeah, that would be great too, around poetry, literature. Yeah.
Yeah, we're all very excited. And, also excited to have someone who's coming from a library. So, yeah.
One of my favorite libraries, the Schomburg. Yeah.
And that question actually is a great segue into what I think might be our last question. Because so Brandee, yesterday you were telling us a great sort of story about one of your favorite books in our collection, and it also happens to be a book of poetry. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, the book is actually not at the Namak Library, but it's still part of the Smithsonian Library's collection. It's at the Dibner Library, which is one of our special collections, rare book libraries. And it's a book of poems by Phyllis Wheatley, which were published in 1773. And the fact that an African-American woman, well, it was actually before America was founded, really. So an African woman who was brought against her will to be enslaved. And of course, the way history is taught, at least it was taught to me as a kid growing up, and the way our greater society talks about African American history as though, okay, those people were slaves and that's it. And we're relegated to a footnote. But here is tangible proof to my young mind at the time when I first read about her that she was creative. She managed to actually publish her poetry. And just reading about her life and seeing the work that she created that has well outlasted her own life so that I can see it. And now it's digitized. So even if I can't get to the tangible book, because we're all home right now, it can still be seen in its original glory, like on the computer. And so that is one of the books that I really cherish within the library's collection, because it's tangible proof of something that I had to grow to learn because it wasn't originally taught to me about someone that's so creative from so long ago.
An amazing poet.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, I should also mention, Gabi, that two of the books I talked about that were put up for adoption and adopted, the Psalms of David and the Langston Hughes Weary Blues, both of those have also been digitized and are available in our digitized collection.
Yeah, and we will. We've shared a lot of links, and we will follow up and share all of those as well. Yeah, this was just fantastic, and I think that is such a great note to end on. Unfortunately, our time is up, so I do hope, going back to our exhibits, I hope that you'll all get a chance to see the Uncle Tom's Cabin exhibit when it reopens after the books have gotten their beauty rest. And I hope you all enjoyed as much as I did learning more about the National Museum of African American History and Culture Library and the crucial role that the Smithsonian Library's books play, not only for research, but also as featured objects in Smithsonian exhibitions. And I just also want to give a thank you again to our generous sponsor, and thank you, all of you, for tuning in today and for supporting the libraries. So, you've heard a number of times today that it's really because of supporters like all of you that we're able to grow and preserve and make our important collections accessible. So we are just so grateful. Before we sign off today, I have a quote that I wanted to leave everyone with. That is just, you know, one of my favorites. It's from our Smithsonian secretary and the founding director of the Namak, Lonnie Bunch. Libraries have shaped the lives of so many, including mine. They're at the nexus of community and service. Our library at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, under the gifted leadership of Shauna Collier, is a beacon that helps make American history and family history accessible and meaningful. The National Museum of African American History and Culture Library makes the museum complete. So thank you so much again for joining us. If you have any further questions or comments or feedback, please don't hesitate to reach out, and you can reach our whole advancement team again at silrsvp@si.edu. And if we didn't get to your questions today, we're going to hopefully try to follow up with you. And you can also share your thoughts by filling out our short survey after the session ends. And if you're not already subscribed to our email list, you can sign up on our website at library.si.edu, and it's about halfway down on the homepage. And that is the best way to stay informed about what we're up to and other special opportunities like this. So have a great evening, and we hope you and yours stay safe and well. Good night.
Thank you, Gabi, and everyone.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Mm-hmm.